How are you doing?
I love you.
How are you?
Hello.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Are You OK? My name is May, and this is a show about sharing honest conversations, sometimes messy, sometimes insightful, but always authentic. I'll be serving up a slice of chaos and comfort as I navigate my life in my 20s. So, whether you are listening while commuting, doing your laundry, or just avoiding your responsibilities, I'm glad you're here. I'm checking in from the Philippines, again, as per usual. I just wanted to start this episode with a weekly recommendation as we do every week. And this is all about music today. Our theme today is about friendships. And I think with friendship comes a feeling of love. And there's an album that I've been listening to constantly that was recently released. It's The Art of Loving by Olivia Dean. And in this album, Olivia Dean explores different manifestations of love in friendship, in romantic relationships, in family, in walking through the park. And it's such a beautiful way of exploring how love is so intertwined in our daily experience. And I would highly, highly recommend listening to it. Olivia Dean is someone that I'm constantly inspired by as a musician, and I think the way that she narrates so authentically really speaks and aligns with what we're trying to do through a podcasting platform. Just sharing stories that are really authentic. For example, her previous album was called Messy, and it was just talking about how her life is not perfect. And I just love that. I love that she put that out there and told the story of the reality of what it is to be a young person living in this life. So highly recommend Olivia's music. I'll also pop the link in the episode descriptions. And just on the side note of music, as I mentioned, I'm also a musician. I've been really trying to, build my confidence and put my music out there. And it's been super, super scary, but also very rewarding to see people's reactions of my music. I sing and I write songs as well. And so if you feel called to do so, please feel free to check out my music. Right now, I only have demos on SoundCloud and BandLab as well. It'll all be linked in the episode description, and also it's on my Instagram as well. So, sorry, just a little plug. It feels very scary and weird to be recommending things that are so personal to me, but I don't know. I hope that the music speaks to you, I guess. Give it a listen. Why not? Okay, so theme 6 of Are You OK? Is about family by choice. Family by choice for us means all of the relationships that shape who we are outside of the family structure and the relationships that we choose to have in our lives. And this usually manifests in platonic and romantic relationships. And in our duo episode 6.1, Ebony and I talked about what it's like being in a long distance friendship. And we have been best friends for a couple of years now, and I've known Ebony for a very, very long time. And it was so interesting debunking what it's been like, the changes, the struggles, the opportunities that come with being long distance best friends. And we gave a couple of tips at the end also for anyone else who is navigating a long distance friendship. So yeah, if this topic interests you, then feel free to check out episode 6.1, what it's like to be long distance besties. All right, so given all of this, what are we talking about today and how does it relate to family by choice? I'm not gonna lie, you guys, it has taken me so much preparation and emotional processing to sit down and make this episode because I have had such conflicting ideas about the topic that I'm about to share. And yeah, it's been a real struggle trying to understand where my values lie and where my opinions lie as well. So I'm really excited to share what we're going to be talking about, which is cross-gender platonic friendships. This topic became of interest to me because I've been talking a lot with my friends about, do you think girls and guys can really just be friends? And I've received so many nuanced and opposing views and perceptions about this idea of how does gender really impact friendships and relationships and the depth at which we can connect. And so, yeah, I thought I would do a little bit of a debunking session and also just flesh out my opinion on this whole topic, this whole debate. But I just want to put a caveat out there. I think I'm always going to keep an open mind about this, and I'm very open-minded to change. And so, yeah, we're going to be covering a little bit about my personal philosophy around gender and relationships, as well as why it's relevant to talk about gender in young adulthood. And then we'll be debunking a couple of gender roles and stereotypes in society as well as in cultural contexts, and also just a couple of tips and tricks that I kind of use to maintain healthy cross-gendered relationships. So yeah, whatever you're doing, Thank you for tuning in. Let's get right into this. So, as I've just introduced, the topic today that we'll be covering is about cross-gendered platonic friendships. And a big caveat that I want to put at the start of this episode is that we're looking at gender as a binary construct, which is very oversimplified and a traditional way to look at gender, which I'm completely understanding of. But the reason why I'm looking at it as a binary construct is because a lot of society and gender norms and stereotypes come from this binary construct. And so in order to talk about what is happening in society and culture, there's kind of a need to talk about it as a binary construct. In saying that, I don't believe that gender is binary, and I think there's so much fluidity in how someone can identify, and it's all just a spectrum, right? When I talk about girls and guys, it just wipes out everything that's in between and the existing people that live in between the binaries. I just want to say that your existence matters and your gender identity is whatever you believe it to be. And I'm fully in support of that. It's just that for this episode, I wanted to debunk gender norms based off binary constructs. So before I share anything else, I just wanted to share a little bit about my personal philosophy and beliefs around gender and relationships. I identify as female and I am cisgender, and my pronouns are she, her. And so that's the perspective that I'm navigating this conversation from. Also, something that I think is really, really relevant to me and why I think the way that I think about gender and relationships comes from the Rudolf Steiner philosophy that I grew up in through my education system. I think this really speaks to the importance of education and how much this has shaped how I see myself and how I see my gender and how I see others. So yeah, if you've been following along on our podcast journey, you'll know that Ebony and I went to a Steiner school. If you want to learn more about our experience growing up in a Steiner school, or you're thinking, what is a Steiner school? Go check out episode 2.1, what it's like growing up at a Steiner school. It's a really, really fun one, and we debunk a lot of things in there. But for today, I just wanted to mention Rudolf Steiner because Steiner education in its fundamentals is co-educational. And so we've always had a mix of genders. And through this, I was taught that individuals should be respected regardless of gender. This really manifested in the way that the teachers and my peers treated me. And from a very, very young age, I always had girl and guy friends. And this just came as a norm. It was an assumption that there was no need to be friends or not be friends with someone based off their gender. And regardless of gender, I grew up doing everything with everyone. And this meant doing stereotypically masculine things as well as feminine things, such as sewing, cooking, cleaning, that kind of housework labor. And then we also did like woodworking, would go to farms and play sports. And I never saw these activities as based off gender. And I think that really speaks to how I see gender now. I have so many guy friends as well as girl friends, and it's always been a norm in my life to not care about gender as much when it comes to platonic relationships. I never knew that this was not the norm for a lot of people, to see gender as such a fluid and non-hierarchical structure. It was only since coming to university that I was exposed to the different perspectives that people have about gender. And yeah, it's been a big learning curve for me to understand others in how they might treat different genders differently. So yeah, that's where I'm coming from. I think it's a very niche perspective and upbringing that I had, which I am very, very grateful about. But also, I've had to learn to communicate and not assuming things. Okay, so that's a little bit about myself. Another thing that I am really, really grateful about my childhood is that I didn't feel the need to be a certain way based off society's gender norms. And this was represented through the way I interacted with boys. You know, I was very like rough and tumble, I guess, quote unquote tomboy, in a sense of I wore shorts and a t-shirt pretty much 24/7. And I also wore dresses. There was nothing that stopped me from dressing either way. And I never felt out of place building fairy houses and things like that. And I also never felt out of place playing soccer on the field or playing tag or anything like that. It was such an abundant childhood in which we were all treated as children, as individuals, not treated in terms of our gender and society's gender norms. So yes, very, very grateful for my education, and it plays a really big part in how I see gender now. So that's why I'm sharing my personal philosophy about this. But to continue this conversation and how it manifests now in young adulthood, I think it's still so important to have friends that are your opposite gender, because I always think about the friends that I've made who are male and have grown up with sisters. And the way that they treat women, typically, if they are close with their sisters, is they have so much more respect and confidence in talking to females, just in general. And it makes me realize how important it is to communicate and relate and navigate life with the opposite gender in platonic relationships. And in young adulthood in general, part of social circles and having friends that you're deeply connected to is such an important protective factor of your well-being and your health. And I genuinely don't think I could be as healthy as I am now without the friends that are around me. The deep connection that I feel with others fulfills this sense of belonging in me, and it just gives me so much more in life. And so yeah, specifically why cross-gender friendships are important, one point is kind of your social and emotional development. And I think the biggest thing about having cross-gendered friendships is that you get to gain a broader perspective on life. You get exposed to different communication styles, emotional expressive styles, and approaches to life and problems. And I think the more knowledge that we gain from the opposite gender, the more aligned we can feel with the rest of the world. Imagine if every guy was only friends with guys and every girl was only friends with girls. We would have such a corrupt world, you know what I mean? I always think like alliance, unification of genders is at the crux of things like feminism and equality. In terms of emotional development, empathy is a massive skill that you learn through gendered relationships. And because you're exposed to such broader perspectives in life, you gain so much by just listening and being empathetic and trying to understand people and trying to fit yourself into their shoes. To be able to understand others takes you such a long way, not just in a personal sense, but also in professional careers, in your academic achievements, so much. And while platonic relationships are different to romantic relationships, they are relationships at the end of the day. So in being part of diverse relationships is such important practice for knowing how to be effective in relationships, full stop. And I really think that my romantic relationships that I've experienced wouldn't have been as good if I didn't have high quality friendships around me. The things that I've learned from being in friendships have directly transferred into my romantic relationships as well. Things like communication, empathy, integrity, honesty, they're values of mine that have all come from these deep connections that I've gained from my platonic relationships. And so, yeah, it's like a really important way to practice communication. And communication differs in these kind of gendered contexts as well. Having exposure to that, I think, really helps you to know how to set your own boundaries and how to communicate them, and also to respect and understand the other person and where they're coming from. And also, the more that you speak with diverse people who are different to you, the more you get to know about yourself. That's pretty much the most beautiful thing, you know. At the end of the day, as much as we can care about others, the person that we are responsible for is ourselves. I think being able to know ourselves better is such a beautiful thing. And I think friends help us to do that, to find that self-awareness, to build our confidence as well, and to understand ourselves better. So yeah, I think in many ways, the importance of cross-gendered friendships is undisputable. And I think it's such a crucial skill set to have, to be able to interact with people from diverse backgrounds, from different genders, and it will take you a long way in your personal and professional journeys. Now, let's talk a little bit about gender roles and gender stereotypes. This conversation is such a big debate, and I think there's a lot to cover that I don't have the time for in this episode. But I think from my personal experience, there are a couple of things and themes that have come up in how people assume and expect out of the friendships that I'm creating that are cross-gendered. And given the society that we live in, with these very strict binary constructs around gender and the roles that are placed upon the differing genders. There are obviously so many challenges that come with having cross-gendered platonic friendships, and these are usually just assumptions that people have about what it means to be a woman, what it means to be a man. And yeah, so I just wanted to share a couple that have come up time and time again. And the first one I wanted to talk about is the burden of emotional labor being on the woman of the friendship. And I think this goes back to the idea of a woman being the caretaker. It's so interesting because it's like society acts as if emotions are a gendered thing, when in fact everyone experiences emotions to an extent, right? I just find that so profound because when I tell people that I study psychology, some people are like, oh, that's very typical of you, you're in a caretaking role. There's this stereotype that women are particularly emotionally intelligent while men are very hard and strong and they don't show emotional vulnerability. And I think for males who haven't really found the self-awareness of realizing the gender roles that they are playing into, and I think this is something that does come up in male-female friendships. Women being expected to be the emotionally intelligent person in the friendship, and guys being more reserved and not talk about their feelings. I think this plays a role into men stereotypically being seen as the protector, and behaviors in which these gendered assumptions manifest in could be like physically protecting the woman from harm or perceived harm, and being the financial caretaker for the relationship, and maybe dressing in a way that it has dominant features or posing in a way that feels very dominating. I think it's interesting how society normalizes the fact that women need to be protected. And I just find this so ironic for the man to be perceived as the quote-unquote protector, because if you look at the statistics, gender-based violence is typically inflicted upon women, right? And the perpetrators of this violence typically tend to be men. And so who are the men protecting us from? I don't know, you tell me. Just, I don't know, I just find it so ironic and funny. But yeah, that's a whole nother conversation that we could have. And lastly, I wanted to talk a little bit about communication styles, because I had this experience recently where I was talking to a guy and he was telling me about this girl that he was messaging online, and she had disclosed to him some gossip that she had heard or some opinion she had about a different person, and he had expressed his personal opinion about it and was essentially trying to find a solution for this woman. And this girl got really upset by that. And the man was just so confused as to what to do, because he was like, oh, I just gave her my opinion and why is she angry at me now? And I asked him, did she ask for a solution or did she just want to be heard? And he was like, oh, I didn't actually think about that. I never asked her if she actually wanted my opinion on this story that she was narrating to me. And so yeah, it's just small things that I think show how stereotypes and gender norms really play a part in how deeply we can connect with the opposite gender, and how it can also impact communication as well. Overall, I think cross-gendered friendships do have a lot of challenges that come up, majority based on social pressures and expectations. And what has been the most interesting thing about navigating cross-gendered friendships is in this very multicultural dynamic that I am a part of. So just to give you context, I am a part of an exchange cohort in this university in the Philippines, and there is 100+ people in this exchange cohort that come from so many different countries. So I've been exposed to so many different communication styles, interaction styles, and it's really led me to try and understand how to communicate cross-culturally in an effective way. And especially when gender comes into play in this conversation, it gets interesting and complicated and nuanced. And so I just wanted to share a couple of things that I've noticed being an Asian Australian coming into the Philippine context, kind of the differences that I've had to navigate around cross-gendered friendships. So to start off, my ethnic heritage is Japanese and Filipino, but for most of my life, I grew up in Australia. So I think I've always lived with a multicultural identity, and it's really helped me interact and connect with a really, really broad range of people. And I'm so grateful for that. I think I have a very unique perspective that I can share as well, because I'm connected to so many different cultures. So I just wanted to share a couple of my thoughts around Australia, Japan, and the Philippines, and how cross-gendered friendships manifest and are maintained in these different cultural contexts. So in the Australian context, I think that gender is seen less as a hierarchical construct and more as a spectrum. And for myself, I've never thought just because I'm a woman, I can't do something. And obviously, that's thanks to my educational upbringing, but also the culture has always taught me to respect myself as an individual. And so I've grown up with so many male friendships, and it's been such a norm for me to treat men as friends, as very deeply connected friends. And I also think, in terms of physical boundaries, I think it's a lot more relaxed in Australia. Like, hugging someone as a greeting is very, very normalized. And I think friendly touching is also very much accepted, regardless of gender. And it's been so interesting contrasting this to Japanese traditional culture, which is a lot more about respecting the binary. Social hierarchies in general play a really important part of the Japanese culture. There's a respect for individuals, but in a sense that is a lot different to how Australians respect the individual. It's been especially difficult to navigate friendships that are gendered. I don't think girl-guy friendships are as normalized in Japan as they are in Australia. And I say this with lived experience of having Japanese male friends and really having to teach them, like, hey, it's okay to talk to me and not feel like we're going on a date or it's going to manifest in anything bigger than friendship. And something I've had to live with from a young age is that how I interact physically with people from Japan is very different to how I would treat individuals maybe in a Filipino or Australian context. And that's because physical boundaries are a lot more respected in Japan, and there's a lot of distance. And I think distance shows respect in Japan. And so there's a lot less acceptance of kind of casual physical affection. And so I think I come with caution and awareness of this when I interact with people from the Japanese cultural context. And finally, the Philippines. I think this is a really interesting take on gender because it's so religiously tied. Catholicism and Christianity are big factors that play in part of how much gender norms are enforced in this society. And so therefore, I think traditional gender roles are upheld and are expected from most people. So that, I think, limits how much connection that I can gain from someone of the opposite gender because we're restricted to these traditional gender roles. But at the same time, it's really interesting because in the Philippines, there's a really, really strong connection to people, especially friends and family. Social connection is so valued in this society. And so navigating physical and social boundaries around cross-gendered relationships here has been really interesting because in terms of physical contact, it's a lot less rigid as in Japan, for example, but there's also kind of emotional limitations as to how much I can deeply connect with people from the Filipino context. So yeah, lots of things to talk about in terms of culture, but that's a little bit of a debunk in how I've been navigating living life and interacting with people in different cultures. And now that we've debunked a little bit about how culture and gender norms play into our cross-gendered friendships, I wanted to deep dive into something I haven't really talked about just yet, which is a really big part of this whole conversation around cross-gendered platonic friendships. And that is, how do they differ from romantic relationships? If you're in a heterosexual romantic relationship, then there's also a deep connection between a girl and a guy. So I've really had to sit down and think, how is this different from being in a romantic relationship without the label? I think one of the most obvious answers to this question of how romantic and platonic relationships are different is the physical boundaries and the nature and intention behind the physical affection. And for platonic relationships, I think it's very context dependent, but generally speaking, platonic friendships are not sexual. So the physical affection that is expressed in platonic relationships is also non-sexual in nature. So this might be like friendly touching, hugs, cuddles, if that's accepted in your social context. And I think for romantic relationships, there is that element of sexual intimacy and connection that differs from platonic connection. Romantic love, I think, manifests itself a little bit differently to platonic love. While they both stem from the same root of, you care about this person, you want to know more about this person, romantic love feels more like an exclusive commitment, by which I mean the person that in which you are romantically loving towards is also tied to different aspects of your life, and there are shared parts of your identity with this person. For example, maybe you depend on each other for your financial stability, your housing, your future family building, and all the responsibilities that come with with being married or in partnership with someone else. I think there's a lot less pressure of that when you're in a platonic friendship because there isn't as much exclusivity or expectation for it to be exclusive. And as much as a friendship can be a commitment, there's a lot less dependency on one person to be your partner in life. And I say all of this, but in my head, it's all a bit of a question mark because it makes me wonder, how would polyamorous relationships fit into this conversation? How do best friends and quote-unquote soulmates fit into this equation? This is my initial take on the differentiation between romantic and platonic love. I think there's a social assumption that exists, and this really ties into the idea of boys are always going to be boys, you know? They're always going to catch feelings. Just because the other person is a girl, they're gonna catch feelings and have sexual intentions with this person. And I truly don't know to what extent this is true. For myself, I trust that emotional maturity will be the protective factor for this in my opposite gendered relationships. This especially might be a challenge for people navigating platonic cross-gendered relationships when both parties are heterosexual. And yes, I think a lot of beautiful romantic relationships start as friendships, but at the same time, not all of them will eventuate into a romantic relationship. And I think that's just a really important reminder to hold, because when we limit ourselves to thinking that guys will always find girls sexually or romantically attractive, I feel like we lose so much opportunity to connect with the opposite gender. Yes, I think in many ways it's a fine balancing act of mutual respect and honesty about intentions behind physical and emotional intimacy in platonic friendships. But I think it's very, very possible for a girl and a guy to be friends at a very deep level and for that to be distinct from a romantic relationship. And yeah, this is something that I've struggled with a lot because I think the perspective that I take around gender and relationships is not the norm, because society likes to build itself on a binary construct. And I've definitely had to navigate some pretty awkward situations where I didn't communicate my intentions well enough to guys, and that's turned into the guy having feelings for me, or people just assuming that I have romantic or sexual interest in them, when in fact I've been assuming that whole time for it to be a platonic friendship. I think I come from like the opposite side of the spectrum to a lot of people. And so yeah, to wrap up this conversation, I just wanted to share a couple of insights that I have learned from being part of cross-gendered friendships. I think the biggest thing that is always talked about and is always undermined in whatever relationship you have is communication. It is such a pertinent thing, and I really don't think you can have a relationship without effective communication. And healthy communication for me means there is consistency and bidirectionality. By this I mean there are regular check-ins with the other person in the friendship, and also that the communication is a two-way thing. So both parties listen to each other and discuss their personal perspectives and opinions to each other. I think regardless of whether it's cross-gendered, same-gendered, communication and learning to be a good, effective communicator is such an important thing, and will get you a long way with being able to connect deeply with people. Respect is a big thing as well, and this is outside of the gendered conversation as well. Respect is such a big core value of mine, and I think every interaction that you have should come from a place of respect. That also goes not only for the other person and for upholding respect for the other person, but also for yourself, and understanding maybe where your boundaries lie and whether the person is respecting that or not. Another thing is that open-mindedness goes a long way in being able to connect deeply with people. Open-mindedness allows you to gain perspectives that are not your own, and also to contrast it and challenge yourself and your assumptions and beliefs about life. And I think when you are discomforted by a topic, there's a lot to learn about that topic. Also, honesty. Honesty is such an important thing to have in relationships. As we said, again, heterosexual platonic relationships can turn romantic, and some of the most beautiful romantic relationships start as friendships. And I think honesty about intention and personal feelings is just something that is of a maintenance factor for having a healthy cross-gendered relationship. honesty and authenticity are just things that really help to unravel our gendered assumptions that we might be playing into very subconsciously. And yeah, it's such a big, crucial factor for how deeply maybe someone can connect with another person. And second to last is establishing and maintaining emotional and physical boundaries. This goes for any relationship, full stop. Again, I think especially in cross-gendered platonic friendships, it's really important to establish from the start what you're comfortable with and what you see is acceptable in a platonic friendship. Again, it's culturally nuanced, it's context dependent, and I think you have to understand that person and what they're comfortable with from the get-go, or else it can get super, super messy. And I think this also goes for emotional intimacy as well. The extent to which you disclose emotional vulnerability to someone can differ, and maybe in some relationships you might be more emotionally connected and emotionally vulnerable than other relationships. And it's just knowing how much the other person is comfortable sharing their emotions and being vulnerable, and also how much you're comfortable as well. I always say that I am an open book, and I always approach every interaction as authentically and as wholeheartedly as I can. And so I always present my heart on a plate, essentially. And I think people that respect that, I keep around, and people who can't understand how to respect that, I put a little bit more distance to. It's important to understand your physical and emotional boundaries around platonic friendships. And lucky last but definitely not least, I believe it's important to treat friends as individuals rather than representatives of their genders. And this ties so beautifully back into the start of this conversation, where Steiner education really taught me the importance of this, seeing and respecting a person as an individual, not by their gender. And I wish that society wasn't so binary in their way of thinking, but being able to be open and vulnerable and having these honest conversations that are really, I guess, quite challenging is one step into unraveling and debunking these social gender norms. So I just wanted to say a massive, massive thank you for sitting down with me or standing up or doing the laundry while I'm in your earbuds. I enjoyed this conversation so much. This might be one of my favorite conversations that I've had so far. I'm just so appreciative of you for checking in and listening to my perspectives. And honestly, I would so appreciate if you shared your perspectives on this topic as well. I really do believe like the perspectives that people have on this discussion around cross-gendered platonic friendships is so culturally and individually nuanced, and I love talking about it because everyone that I've talked to so far has had different perspectives and understandings of it. And yeah, if you'd like to share your insights into it, please feel free to comment on the podcast platform that you're listening to, or check us out on our Instagram as well. So just to summarize all the things that we talked about today, I shared my personal philosophy about gender and friendships and talked about how Steiner education has played a big role in how I see people and gender. And then we moved on to why having cross-gendered platonic friendships is so important in our 20s and in our young adulthood, and how it's such a protective factor for our self-development as well as our well-being. And then we moved on to how society expects us to behave in a certain way based on our gender, and how gender norms and stereotypes impact how deeply we can connect with the opposite gender. And this brought up the conversation around cultural nuances and differences between how the perception, expression, and maintenance of cross-gendered friendships manifest in different cultures, specifically Australia, Japan, and the Philippines, because that's my cultural context. And we also talked a little bit about the differences between being in a platonic cross-gendered friendship versus a romantic relationship. And lucky last, I gave a couple of insights into how to maintain a healthy cross-gendered platonic relationship. I really hope you gained something from this. Again, this is just my personal take on this topic, and I do really believe that I'm still learning, and I'll continue to develop my understanding of friendships and how gender plays a role in it. And so, yeah, take this with a grain of salt, but I think it's important to start thinking about these things at least. And so, yeah, that brings us to the end of this episode. If you enjoyed this episode, please take a moment to subscribe to the podcast and leave a review. You can also join the conversation by following us on Instagram at areyouokcake.pod. And also please don't forget to check the show notes, where you'll find links to all of the resources that were mentioned in today's episode, including the references that I used in today's discussion. Wherever you are tuning in from, I hope you continue to have a good morning, day, afternoon, night. And I will catch you guys very, very soon in our next conversation. See ya!